And I'm really delighted to be here at my first AHA conference and here on the land of the Guana people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Sarah Brooks is the focus of my PhD research. She was a settler-coloniser of remote southeastern Western Australia and a prolific botanical collector. And this image is from the Esperance Museum, and it's the one place where she is known outside of the botanical world. So in telling her story through an environmental humanities project, I'm weaving lots of different threads, but I'm going to focus here on the eco-biography. And as the name suggests, eco-biography is all about that interaction of a person and a place and how an environment and a place might shape a person and their life events. And I'm aspiring to take that further and turn it into a more than human biography and really look at how Sarah was entangled in the place that she lived. She didn't leave behind a huge archive, or what is surviving anyway, so not enough to write a conventional biography, but I'm now sort of thinking about how I can use that archive of herbarium specimens that she gathered as an archive to tell her story, her ecobiography, and the more than human history of the place. And of course, I'm writing about a settler coloniser in a period of often violent colonisation, so I am very much grappling with how I decolonise this whole research project. So in the year that she died, she was one of very few women to be featured in this celebratory Our Pioneers Gallery. And in this piece, she talked about what it was that lured her and her mother and brother from Victoria to take up land far from the busy haunts of men, as she described it. So these very kind of generous inducements that the colonial government was trying to entice settlers with. She says that they were warned that the country wasn't ideal, but it has always struck me just what a flimsy bedrock of information they had in making this huge upheaval from Victoria. They left Victoria, arrived in Albany. The first stage of their journey was walking to Esperance, a journey of about 500 kilometres. And then the first place that they ended up for any length of time was Israelite Bay. It's now within the Cape Arid National Park, which probably gives you a sense of the kind of country it is. And they found themselves right at the edge of the southwest botanical province, or what we now know as the southwest Australian Floristic region. It's a very dodgy rendering, so don't take that. And at Israelite Bay, there was a telegraph station established as part of the east-west telegraph line that linked Western Australia to the rest of the country, and that's where they found themselves at for a short period of time. In heading out there, they found themselves in the Esperance Plains fire region. It's a Proteaceae-dominated Quangan shrubland with some mallee heathland. The word Quangan or Quangan might not be familiar. It's a Noongar name for the sandplain country and the vegetation community it supports. And the fact that it's one of the few Noongar terms for different ecosystem types tells me how endemic and how quintessentially West Australian it is. So it's also a country of sandplain, salt lakes, weathered ancient granite outcrops, erratic rainfall, and very limited fresh surface water. So you probably understand it. It's not a country that's screaming out to be settled as pastoral country. And even though this area is celebrated now for its rich biodiversity and its high levels of endemism, and it's now a nationally protected ecological community, it certainly wasn't celebrated back then. Whenever you see it written about in this era of pastoral expansion, it's usually with the words worthless or desolate or dreary in front of it. These generous inducements for luring the pastoralists out into that country seem actually to be partly about news reaching Perth of South Australian parties who were starting to explore along the south coast. So this sense that Western Australia really had to sort of, populate the colony and get people out there. So this pressure that Geoffrey Bolton wrote about for colonial Western Australia to develop their isolated colony. And it really exemplifies to me the difference between the American and the Australian frontier that Tom Griffiths writes about, where the Antipodean parables of the plains are far less about the entrepreneurial freedom celebrated in America and much more about national and racial anxiety. And as you can probably imagine, the Brooks family never prospered and pretty much lived out the remainder of their life in this country in quite abject poverty, I think. But Sarah in 1883 was living in Israelite Bay, and she saw this request from Baron von Mueller to join in his botanical researches and collect plants for him. And I'm definitely not the first one to notice how perfectly targeted this message seems to be for a woman like Sarah, educated, accomplished, living out in a very remote area and maybe looking for an intellectual engagement. And she found herself in this incredibly rich biodiversity, and she seemed to absolutely relish the opportunity to join Mueller in his botanical collecting. I doubt that Mueller needs any introduction, but just in case, he was Victoria's first government botanist, but he almost by default became Australia's first botanist with his ambitions to write the definitive flora of Australia. And to do that maintains this huge network of collectors, and a good portion of them were women, and 225 of them have been sort of plucked from obscurity by Sarah Morosky and Alison Vaughan, and Sarah's one of those. But Mueller also had a real interest in Western Australia, and as early as 1867, he was noting the kind of peculiarities of the Southwest Botanic region and the incredible high number of species and the high levels of endemism. Sarah, collecting at that very edge of this biogeographical border that Mueller was just starting to sort of identify, she would have been incredibly valuable to his project. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot more specimens that she collected that ended up all around the world, but nearly 1,000 remain in a herbarium in Victoria, in Melbourne, covering over 500 species, and nearly half of those were endemic to the southwest and that south coastal strip. And it's probably at this point I should note, of course, that this imperial project of collecting and renaming, and it's not something I can really go into now, but I am very mindful of it. And as Judith Skeen said, the act of naming in botany is as much a part of the imperial naming project as are the renaming of places by explorers. So with that in mind, Mueller did, as we know, rename an awful lot of plants, including many that were sent to him by Sarah. And he commemorated her in naming 2 plants after her, a Scaevola and a Hakea. So I think for most of his female collectors, they were lucky to get one if they were, very prolific for him. So I feel like this is an indication that he really valued her contribution. She also collected seaweed specimens, and I've just recently been able to track them down in the Lund Herbarium, and I'm going to go and visit them soon. So very exciting. And there's also a red algae named after her as well. I want to focus on the writing with plants and the use of this herbarium archive in telling Sarah's story. And I've been really inspired by John Ryan's methodology of phytography, of writing with plants, which is multisensorial, ecological, field-based, collaborative, reflexive, and an arts-based practice, which basically just sounds like the most amount of fun to me, and it has been great fun. I've been spending as much time as I can out where Sarah collected. I've been using the list of specimens she collected in terms of my own kind of travels and investigations of the place. I did get a official license to collect the plants in case anyone's freaking out about this. It's all legitimate. And I've just been sort of playing with plants a whole lot, with printmaking, with cyanotypes, with botanical inks, with botanical dyes, any way to sort of get into the plants and sort of come at the plants from multiple directions. But it is a thesis. I do need to use my words too. So I'm definitely doing that also. And so I guess there's a more conventional use of this kind of herbarium archive to inform, biological, ecological context. So I'll sort of gloss over that one and talk about the other two. So utilising the herbarium as a biographical archive, and also focusing on the individual stories that might have a more than human story to tell. So in 1883, Sarah responded to that newspaper article from Mueller, and you might not be able to read her handwriting, so it reads, Miss Brooks presents her compliments to Baron Sir Ferdinand von Mueller and begs to state that in consequence of a paragraph in the West Australian newspaper, she has dried and now forwards some plants which she hopes may prove useful. Accompanying that was 58 specimens, and I wish I could have seen the look on Mueller's face, because quite a large number of his women collectors only sent 10 specimens across their whole interaction with him. So 58 specimens from a place he would have been intensely interested in just, I think, announced her as a very serious collector. And the other thing that did was what she collected. So in that newspaper article, he asked collectors not to overlook the smallest and minutest and commonest annuals. And so in this first collection, she ignored all of those charismatic plants out there, the hakeas and grevilleas and banksias and all of the eucalypts, and just focused on what he'd asked for. So I think a very productive working relationship started. And so looking at her specimens in detail, I was so delighted in the Melbourne Herbarium to find these notes that I hadn't known existed. They're not catalogued in the database. And they tell me that Sarah was really engaged in the botanical science. She was trying to place the plants. She was giving Mueller ecological context and descriptions of habit. She wasn't just sending plants off without thinking about them. And she was clearly responding to instruction by Mueller as well. And real attention to detail, just in the way she prepared and attached the notes to the specimens. And I just can tell all this information about her personality through these objects. The other way that I'm trying to use these plants is look for those stories that come out of individual species. And this plant came to me when I was looking for a plant that she might have seen in Geelong, where she was living, then in Albany, and then out at Israelite Bay. And you can imagine that there actually weren't that many plants that really cover that geographical reach, and this one did. And it's a really common plant. It's so common that a Perth suburb was named after it. We have a suburb of Dianella, and so common that it was out in my back garden, and these photos are from my garden. And I started investigating the plant a little more and realised its incredible multiple uses as a food source and a medicinal plant that I'd been completely oblivious to. And it sort of brought to mind the stories of these first blundering colonisers moving through this country who had no understanding of it, no understanding of the plant life, were succumbing to scurvy despite being surrounded by plants, full of vitamin C. And, it's really brought home to me this idea of plant blindness and my own plant blindness as a product of settler colonial culture and the whole plant blindness of settler-coloniser culture in general. And Robin Wall-Kimmerer said this in an interview. We are hardwired to know plants. When you think about the hundreds of thousands of plants that there are, you had better know which one is medicine and which one will really give you a stomachache. It's just this idling of time in the industrial age that we have become plant blind. So I am trying to become unplant blind, starting to try and see the plants a little more. So I just wanted to finish just with a few comments about the decolonisation process. There's a lot more questions than answers at this point. Grappling, with what it means for me to write this history and write about that history of colonisation as a product of the ongoing settler colonial culture of Western Australia. And I'm really grappling with how to respectfully and ethically convey the cultural history of these plants, to kind of walk that narrow path between appropriation and honouring, given that it's not a project I can co-author with the First Nations people I'm working with. Like I said, more questions. Another complication is that Israelite Bay sits just inside the border of two native title determination areas. So there's the Esperance Noongar in the green and the Nudju in the red, which is an extra kind of complication. The final question, I guess, is was Sarah Brooks a different kind of settler coloniser with a more nuanced understanding of the First Nations people that she lived with? And there's a little bit of evidence, I think, that suggests that she was. And I just want to focus on something that she wrote that contrasts with her brother in that same article that was in our Pioneers Gallery. John, her brother, was featured in this same series. When he talked about the land, he described it as unoccupied, and that there was no other mention of the First Nations people that they basically took the land from. Sarah, on the other hand, she wrote that she found that the government had been very liberal with something which did not belong to it, that the leaders of the more ancient race, whose race had lived in undisputed possession, were not inclined to waive their rights to anyone. So I've been through as many of the people featured in our Pioneers Gallery as I can get my hands on, and I have not seen any other kind of articulation of Aboriginal sovereignty yet. So I might just finish on that. In coming to sort of think about Sarah's life, this all started for me when I found out about her story as just a question of how did a single, accomplished, educated woman live out the 54 years of her life in this incredibly remote and isolated place, and just, all this uncovering of what her life was and what sustained her. And I really perceive there's a depth of connection to the place that she lived, to the plant world that she had to document, and to the Nudju and the Wajiri Noongar people that was really unusual for her time. And this makes her an incredibly compelling research subject for me.